Jason. This is Chicago Mastering Service. We're feeding the lathe from this audio workstation, which is running on a software called Sequoia, which is a PC-based software that I use. Bob uses a different platform. We each have our own computer. But we have a digital router that can basically kind of send our little computer world wherever it needs to go. So we send a delay signal. There's a signal that comes first to the lathe, which is one platter rotation ahead of the actual signal that's going to be cut into the record, and that is what goes to this pitch computer that varies the pitch, so that if the music is very quiet, this thing will go ahead and slow down the speed towards the inside of the disc, and it'll get the grooves very close together so that you're not wasting potential cutting time. But then if it sees a big transient coming, it needs to see that in advance, so that if you had grooves stacking up and all of a sudden there was a big bass cut, it would just cut back into the grooves that it had just been putting very close together. But since it sees everything one rotation ahead, it can see that, oh, here's a big hit coming, and it'll space it out so that it can cut back towards the previously cut grooves without cutting into them. That's where we need a delay, yeah. So we're basically sending two stereo signals to this lathe, and one feeds the preview head, this is what they call it, it's just basically this pitch computer, and then the other one feeds the actual cutter head. Preview head is actually a term that came from when they used to do this with tape machines. What they had was a tape machine with two playback heads. So the tape would come across the preview head, then it would go through a little series of rollers that delayed it for X amount of time, like about just over 1 second for a 33 RPM disc, and then it would come back across the cutter head. So that's what they call a preview head. But in this case, it's just a preview digital signal. The other thing you typically do with this sort of cut is roll off just the very lowest frequencies and then tend to roll off the ultra highs, because most of what you're going to ever hear is going to roll off at about 16 or 17 kilohertz. And beyond that, you're just generating heat at the cutter head. It's trying to cut things that aren't really musically relevant. So usually you just put a little high and low pass filter for most material, and then the other thing that is sort of a standard process for us is that the low frequency tends to be slightly exaggerated when you cut something onto vinyl flat. So we usually find a point at which we remove about a dB of low frequency material, which is usually somewhere between 120 and 220 hertz or something. So I usually just throw something up that's about what my good guess is. And then we start doing some test cuts, which is simply cutting a portion of this material onto a piece of scrap disc and then going back into the control room and playing that back and A/Bing it against the unprocessed version that we're trying to match. Those scrap discs generally are accumulated when we blow a cut because the chip doesn't pick up at the very beginning or things like that, or you just, any number of reasons. So then it's like, oh, I blew a cut, here's a scrap disc. We had a very large supply of scrap discs for the first year and a half that we were doing this, but we've actually gotten decent enough to the point where we got really low for a while, but it's actually doing pretty good now. I have a little checklist over here behind you that I usually go through too. Let's see, one thing I didn't do is I need to check the bass correlation. The other problem you can get with vinyl cutting is the bass frequencies need to be fairly in polarity with one another, or phase. It's usually called phase, but if you have a lot of out-of-phase bass material, the way the basic situation works with cutting is that the cutter head has a little stylus that's kind of a V shape, and it's being driven by a couple of 45-degree angled rods, or approximately 45, I believe it's 45. Well, 90 from each other, but 45 from vertical. And what they're essentially doing is, as if they were a left and right speaker, they're pushing the needle, the cutting stylus in and out, and the polarity of the channels is reversed, so that instead of an in-phase signal making the needle go up and down by both pushing at the same time, it actually is reversed, so that when music is in mono, it's just pushing the stylus from side to side and making a groove like this. If you get material that is out of phase in the lower frequencies, what happens is you start to get both of the little push rods pushing down at the same time, so that instead of getting a groove that goes like this, you get a groove that goes like this, vertical. And it's essentially just making it deeper and shallower. And so what ends up happening sometimes is that ends up being sort of like a little jump ramp for the needle, and it makes it difficult to track. And sometimes if it's too extreme, what will happen is it'll cut up so far that the chip will break, the thread that we were talking about earlier, and then in the middle of the cut, you just have that stuff bunching up and you've blown the cut. So usually if stuff is problematic, you can see on this gauge, which is basically registering the vertical activity that's going to be required by the material. In this case, this is very good. It's basically not moving at all. If it were swinging up here past the middle, then I would start to think that we had sort of a problem. And then in those cases, you usually use in this case, an electronic plug-in. There used to be old analog devices that would basically mono the frequencies below a certain specified crossover point. So basically we have a plug-in now that does the same thing, which is like a multi-band stereo imaging plug-in. But in this case, we don't have to use that. Normally, if something was problematic, we would go up to maybe like somewhere between 100, 160 hertz or so and put the bass into mono. It can make it sound different, and sometimes it's actually flattering. Sometimes it kind of makes, sometimes it kind of enhances the stereo image of the rest of the music if the bass is nice and centered. And I mean, generally speaking, I find it to be sort of just a principle of good recordings to have the bass fairly centered as an image. But, you know, that principle, such as it is kind of based on mono compatibility and other issues that have to do with vinyl cutting. But, you know, it's sort of one of those things that I think is just generally regarded as like good mixing etiquette, unless you're trying to do something really wacky, you know, and vinyl is not an issue. But in this case, this is going to be great because it's all very well centered in the bass.